Bruce Cascadden was an old-time cowboy and poet who worked in Colorado and Arizona. In the 1920s, Cascadden went to Hollywood to find work in the movies, and it's said that he drove chariots in the original silent version of Ben-Hur. He eventually started working as a bellhop in a Los Angeles hotel, and he continued in that work for the rest of his life. But he continued to write poetry about his cowboy days. And along the way, he became one of the most loved and recited of all cowboy poets. I'd like to recite a Cascadden poem to start today's show. This is titled, The Time to Decide. Did you ever stand on the ledges, on the brink of a great plateau, and look from their jagged edges on the country that lay below? When your vision met no resistance, and there was nothing to stop your gaze till the mountain peaks in the distance stood wrapped in a purple haze. On the winding water courses and the trails on the mountain sides where you guided your patient horses on your long and lonesome rides, where you saw earth's open pages, and you seemed to understand as you gazed on the work of ages, rugged and rough, but grand. There, the things that you thought were strongest, and the things that you thought were great, and for which you had striven longest seemed to carry but little weight, while the things that were always nearer, those things that you thought were small, seemed to stand out grander and clearer as you looked from the mountain wall. While you're gazing on such a vision and your outlook is clear and wide, if you have to make a decision, that's the time and the place to decide. And although you return to the city and mingle again with the throng, though your heart should be softened by pity or bitter from strife and wrong, though others may laugh in derision, and that voice from the past grow dim, you stick to the cool decision that you made on the mountain rim. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy west and beyond. My guest today is Martha Scanlan. Martha is a singer and a songwriter who lives and works on a small cattle ranch in southeastern Montana. I sat down with Martha on the third floor of the Western Folklife Center in Elko, Nevada, during the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering. We had a great visit, and I really enjoyed getting to know Martha, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Here's Martha Scanlan.
I ended up coming to the Cowboy Poetry Gathering because Hal Cannon was doing, and Taki Talanides were doing a piece about Montana artists. And Hal had known about my music, and they came to interview me on the ranch. And at this point, I had been living and working on this ranch in southeastern Montana, kind of off the Tongue River, for, a number of years at that point, maybe 5 or 6 years. And they came to interview me, and Hal was asking about the first song I wrote. And the first song I wrote, I didn't start writing songs till I was, well into my 20s. And the first song I wrote was about the ranch, but it was the first time I had ever been there. And my friend, who's fourth generation on that ranch, we went to college together in Missoula. And my boyfriend and I at the time had just moved to East Tennessee to learn about old-time music. And we went back to play at her wedding. And I had never been to the ranch. And I was so blown away that such a place would exist where people were so bound to a place for so many generations, and all of these stories kind of wove everyone together, and it was just very moving to me. And so on the way back, on the flight back to Tennessee, I wrote my first song, and it was about the ranch, and it's called Up on the Divide. And it ended up, and the funny how Hal is woven into this whole story was that he's interviewing me, and he says, wow, that song was a whole foreshadowing of what was going to happen in your life. And I had never thought about that. It was pretty mind-blowing. I was writing about things that I didn't understand. I didn't know I'd end up working there and living there. It all kind of came about in a sort of accidental sort of way, because I would stay with them then when I was touring. I was in a band at the time. Or if I was driving across country, I'd come and stay and work, and then I'd stay longer, and we became very good friends. And then about 8 years ago now, my friend Jeannie, her husband, had to have hip replacement surgery. And so I said I'd, take some time off in the fall and help him with the fall work. And then I moved into this cabin, and then I just never left. But yeah, that's how I ended up at the gathering, and how I ended up meeting Hal, and all of, really most of my songs have come out of that place, have come out of that landscape, and out of that particular ranch. So,
did you grow up around ranching and cows and horses, or was that your first experiences? Was that when was that, when, like, writing that first song and you being in Montana?
That would have been like 15 years ago. I guess that would have been right around the year 2000, which sounds very biblical when I say it like that. But yeah, it's right around that time when I was, had just moved to Tennessee. But no, I didn't. But I was a really weird kid. Like, all I wanted was to ride horses. And my first books I read were Zane Grey's. And I drew pictures of the ranch I was going to live on someday. And I played horses, and I drew horses, and collected horses, and wore cowboy boots and a cowboy hat in St. Paul, Minnesota. And my family had my great-grandfather came out working for the railroad, at the turn of the last century. And my grandparents lived in Helena. And so my family, I was going out to Montana in the summertime. But yeah, it's very strange, that my life ended up taking a very circuitous route to that, just what I had always dreamt of.
When you were younger, how did you get into old time music?
I think I ended up it came out of growing up, my family's musical, but mostly I was just really, my parents had an amazing record collection. I grew up on this great music, and, like Bob Dylan and early Van Morrison and the Beatles and Irish folk music and classical music and, just kind of everything. So I loved music, but I didn't start playing guitar and singing till I was in my early 20s. I was just kind of shy. And so I think just listening to a lot of different music and then starting to follow the roots back to, this is actually a bluegrass song. Oh, that bluegrass song is an old time song. Oh, that's actually an old Irish song. I mean, just getting kind of interested in the roots of different kinds of music. So, yeah, we were, my boyfriend and I were living in Montana and playing bluegrass music, and ended up going to East Tennessee to, hang out with old fiddlers, and he was doing a program at East Tennessee State for, they have an old-time music program, but also kind of folklore and stuff like that. So there was a real richness about the way I was really struck by how that music, like old-time music in North Carolina and Tennessee and Kentucky, how it's so interwoven with the landscape and with people. And I was just so fascinated by that, and it made me wonder what the landscapes that I loved sounded like. What is the music of the places I love? And I really missed Montana. I loved living there, but I missed home a lot. And so I wrote my first songs about missing these landscapes that I loved, and kind of inspired by people missing places that they had left behind and loved. So, yeah, it's like the westward expansion of longing. I was in an old-time band that started touring a lot, and I was writing songs, and so we were doing old, traditional songs, but then we were also doing songs that we wrote. And that went into, I guess the band broke up in maybe 2005. And then and at that point anyways, I was my music was kind of going in a different direction. And I wanted to be true to that. And kind of finding out what my own kind of landscapes were, and being drawn back out west in that sense. But yeah, I think there was also, when I was in the band was called Real Time Travelers, and we did a tour that was loosely having to do with the movie Cold Mountain and the soundtrack to that. So there were some people on that tour, Dirk Powell and Riley Bogus and Norman and Nancy Blake. There was a band from New York called Olabelle that became really good friends, and they were really into kind of old gospel music and all these. It was a great tour. It was like 6 weeks, and we would just stay up all night and play music and mess around with different kinds of music, and that was really inspiring to me. I was really kind of being drawn to different sounds and kind of going back to my own roots of music that I loved, like the band and Bob Dylan and stuff that I grew up with. And so kind of looking for the roots in that.
The great American poet and farmer Wendell Berry has said this: "If you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are." In an essay on the sense of place, Wallace Stegner wrote that no place is a place until it has had a poet. I asked Martha to tell me about the place where she lives and works, and how that place and that work has informed her writing.
Yeah, so the ranch, that community, there's a lot of old ranches that have been there since the late 1800s. So these families have been working together for generations, which is not uncommon. It's uncommon for, if I'm talking to people, this is one of the places where it's not uncommon, I guess, at the Cowboy Poetry Gathering. People are like, oh yeah, of course, But that's something that's just really beautiful. I work still sometimes. So my friend Jeannie, her dad, his grandfather, he's third generation there. Sorry, I'm being very inarticulate here. So I spent a lot of time with an old cowboy who's 85 this year, and he still ropes and rides and roars around. but I just feel so blessed to have had that time with him and such a patient teacher. There's a huge kind of nuisance to help ratio that I was always trying to lean into the help side, but, with varying degrees of success. But it's beautiful country. Southeastern Montana, it's almost kind of high deserty. There's yucca and juniper trees and kind of red scoria rock and sandstone and a lot of grass, really good grass as well. But, a little prickly pear cactus. It also kind of has this high deserty sort of feel to it. And it's not a place where you could work cattle on four-wheelers. Everything's on horseback. So it's just such beautiful ancient work. And I was, being able to learn from people that have been doing that their whole lives was just, it's such beautiful, just the quiet, patient work. I could sit and watch people sort cattle all day. It's just so beautiful and quiet. And all of I think my music got really quiet. And I remember when I started playing with John Neufeld, that was something that he noticed, were these just spaces between things, between notes, just this space. And I think the landscape really informed that for me. And just that whole, I think I started to really appreciate the flow and the current in that work, and how much alike music that is, just kind of listening and writing, listening to that current. And my friend Irv that I worked for used to, he's a wonderful reader and a poet and can remember poems and would recite them. He could, we'd be working and something had come up and he'd recite like Badger Clark or Yeats or this kind of, and very funny. But he used to say that good writing is like a well-crafted boat that just cuts through the water real smooth.
Texas cowboy and poet Joel Nelson has reflected on the relationship between his work and his poetry and said this: "The poetry comes from our life, and without the life, we wouldn't have the experience to write that poetry. But then the work that we do is re-entered with a freshness that we wouldn't have had we not gone and shared that poetry with our contemporaries. So it's a symbiotic relationship. The poetry feeds the work, and the work feeds the poetry." I asked Martha if that was true in her experience as well.
Yeah, very much. Very much. And then, just being around somebody that's still just so, living there for his whole life, and being 85 and still being just as delighted by the sweet peas coming up, or just as delighted by wind blowing through tall grass, and yeah, still always so stunned by the beauty of that place and knowing how lucky he is to be part of it. And, so it wasn't like being around people who are like, oh, so yeah, but I do find that, especially I think I think that was, a lot of it was just working with things, working with the energy of something, seeing when it's not working, or, just going with whatever way the cattle are going, going with that flow and not getting ahead of them and learning how to bend them so that, you're not messing everything up. just that flow is so much of what music is to me that I think the two became really entwined for me. Yeah. And sometimes, and also sometimes just very, sometimes I would get really lonely, and I had to lean into that place in a way that I don't think I've really had to lean into a landscape before. I could always find something to distract me, or, some other place to hide from things. So this song is from this most recent record, and it comes out of this time in the ranch, and it also came out of a time a few years ago, and a really good friend of mine is Amy Helm, and her dad's Levon Helm from the band, and I spent time with those guys and playing music with them, and he was a big influence on my music in a lot of different ways, but I think he's kind of part of that thread of, for me, where kind of ranch work meets music, and because he was so much just about the groove, finding the groove in everything, and I think that was the biggest influence on me I got from him in that sense. The first time I played music with him, it was actually, I felt so, it was like being in the physical space of this groove. It was just this huge space. And that really stuck with me, and I think that ranch work is very much that way too, just kind of finding the groove in the work. But when he was dying, and Amy was with him in the hospital in New York, and they hadn't told anybody. They had taken him off life support, and he wasn't, so he was just kind of crossing over, and he was such a public person that it was just this real quiet time for them. And I was at the ranch, and it was April, and it was just at that time when the first flowers are coming up, and the last of the hard winter, the winter storms are over, and the grass is coming up, and there are little flowers called Stars of Bethlehem, these little beautiful little lilies, and they look so fragile, but they're strong. And I was just kind of holding this vigil for them, and I don't know what it really means to hold a vigil, but just kind of keeping them in my thoughts. And while I was walking around, and so the little Stars of Bethlehem flowers are in this song, and just all of those stories and the work. Anyways, this song's called The Shape of Things Gone Missing, The Shape of Things to Come.
Sound of horses, sound of the horses running by in the night. Underneath the darkness of darkness, woke up to horses just before the first light. Just before the first light. Oh, can you feel it? Can you feel it down inside? Underneath the snow and the spent brown, green grass rising, rising like a slow tide. Rising like a slow tide. Take with me what I remember when your father died. There sweet, sweet stars of Bethlehem, stars of Bethlehem blooming on the hillside. Blooming on the hillside. Follow the paint by the white on his sides. Follow the sweet current of the current. Bring you a good horse just before the sunrise. Just before the sunrise. Faith can be the shape of the river. Faith can be what's torn open wide. Faith can be the sweet stars of Bethlehem, stars of Bethlehem blooming on the hillside. Blooming on the hillside. Blooming on the hillside. Blooming on the hillside.
Wow, that was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to do this.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. It's so nice to talk to you. I'm so curious. I was like, maybe I can interview him.
All right, folks, that's it for this episode. I'd like to thank Martha Scanlan for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Martha at marthascanlan.com. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com. If you're enjoying this show and would like to help support it, you can leave a tip on the website. Or you could write a review of the show and give me a rating on the iTunes store. And you could also pass the word along to a friend, someone you think might enjoy the show. If you have questions or comments or stories you'd like to tell me, you can send me an email. Send it to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.